welcome to week 5 of Drawing with All the Senses, and this week we're going to talk about perspective drawing. Perspective drawing is a system that's attributed to Renaissance Italy, to the artists Brunelleschi and Alberti, and one of the notable aspects of this period in history in Western art history tradition is that these artists were also mathematicians and scientists, and they were involved in trying to figure out, using science and math and art, which were all very combined, the rules of the divine creation is what it really was. So the system of perspective was devised to create the illusion of dimensional depth on a flat surface, on a flat picture plane. And it's very powerful stuff. Our work can look really a lot realer, and I'm putting that in air quotes because I want you to think about what real even means, or what realism or reality even means. Sort of a sneaky question. I also want you to think about what mastery means as well. But in the Western art history tradition, that period of Renaissance art, which has Michelangelo and includes Da Vinci and Alberti and Brunelleschi and others, is sort of attributed with this fraught idea of quality or high level of achievement. And I hear from students that they often have this sort of sense that that's what must be attained for something to be great or mastered or good. Perspective drawing is really fun. It can be challenging at first, and I'll try to break it down and make it as simple as possible. It's definitely important to learn and very useful tool in our drawing toolbox. But before we start, I do want to talk about a couple of ideas that maybe offer a critique to perspective drawing. A couple of thinkers you might want to look into are Laura Mulvey, who writes in Visual and Other Pleasures a critique of the idea of this thing called the gaze. Bell Hooks is another theorist and writer who talks about the gaze. And one of the reasons I bring this up, especially in this period in history, is that these thinkers and writers are talking about who gets to do the seeing, who gets to position the camera, and who gets to compose the picture, and why. And why that's pertinent to perspective is because perspective presumes a view of the world that converges on the eye of one individual. And you'll see that when we look at how the rules are, because everything is relating the picture or the depiction of reality to the eye line and the position of one viewer. So when we look at the rules of perspective in mathematical terms, it's easy to see it. It's tricky, deceptive, because we see it as sort of living on this distant horizon. It's sort of emanating outward. But really the lines, and it's a visual illusion, converge pyramidically, meaning as a big sort of pyramid, into one eye. And so thinkers like Mulvey and Hooks and others talk about the sort of what the problems of having a world view of reality converge in one eye, because it asks again, whose eye? Who does the seeing, and who does the picture making, and who gets to depict what reality is? The other artist I think you might want to look at in context of this, and there are many, but I'll throw out Pablo Picasso because he's more of a household name, if you will, and he's often quoted with art quotes and so forth. What's interesting to me about Picasso is that by the time he was 18, he could paint as well as any Renaissance master, for sure, and then very deliberately broke away from that, and is known for things like Cubism, for example, where there is no perspective at all. Which was quite shocking in its time, because these sort of prefixed notions of what mastery were sort of shattered by many of those early 20th century artists. And still to this day there exists sort of critique of that period. But a lot of those artists, including Picasso, were trying to work against the notion of the reality being depicted and defined by one eye. And in Cubism, the question is asked, how can we look at one reality from many different points of view? Kind of like the McLaren drawing we have at the beginning, the Tesseract in House. And so when thinking about art, it's deeply embedded with many things, but one of them is worldview, who gets to do the looking and seeing, and what is reality in the first place. So I probably rambled on too much. We're just going to break down one-point perspective this week. We'll get to some very simple rules. I'll try to make it as easy as I possibly can. But in the back of your mind, I want you to ask the question, whose eye gets to do the looking and making the pictures? I think it's a fundamental question of our time. All right, I'll see you on the other side. The beach, a great place to get away, and also a great place to study the ideas of linear perspective, because we have an unobstructed view for as far as the eye can see. This system was developed and attributed to Leon Battista Alberti of Florence, and it's a mathematical system that looks at the way the relationship of the viewer or the eye to the outside world can be depicted mathematically, and will result in the illusion of dimensional depth on a 2D picture plane. The idea here is that we have something called the horizon line, which is different than the horizon, as we'll see in a minute. But the horizon line really is the eye level of the viewer. And once that's established, we can put together a system of lines that will help us serve as a guide to developing this sense where objects appear to be receding into space into what's called a vanishing point. That vanishing point looks like it's in the distance, but it's really the eye of the viewer. First, we have to establish what's called the picture plane, and the picture plane is most often a rectangle in our tradition, but it doesn't have to be. The important thing about the edge of that plane is that everything we're going to do after that relates to where that rectangle is. I want to also make a distinction between what's often called the horizon, which we can see here clearly at the beach, and how that's different than the eye line, or what's sometimes called the horizon line. You can see the tracks in the sand, and they point and converge somewhere right at my eye level. And we'll see how this works. And that point of convergence is where we establish what's called a vanishing point, and all lines will converge into that point. That vanishing point is on the eye line, but it's confusing because it's sometimes called the horizon line. There are only three kinds of lines in one-point perspective, and those are lines that are perpendicular to the horizon line or the camera line, parallel to the horizon line or camera line, and what are called orthogonals, which converge into that vanishing point. And from there we can use those guides to create objects that look like they exist in dimensional space on that 2D surface. So the picture plane, which is the red box, the yellow line, which is the camera line, often called the horizon line, and the purple dot, that's the vanishing point. And from there we can create a system of grids that will allow us to place objects. It looks like it's receding into the depths, but also think about this grid as coming forward into the eye of the observer. So it's really an optical illusion that kind of goes both ways. This illusion we can use to make one-point perspective, which we'll do this week, but there's also two-point perspective, three-point perspective, four-point perspective. I thought it fitting to use this photograph I took in 2019 at Santa Croce, where Alberti is buried. And you can see by analyzing this photograph that the lines of the buildings converge right into where my camera was. And except for on the outside of this iPhone, you can see that there's some lens distortion making the parallax of the columns look like they're slanted. But if we look at any photograph, we can easily find where that camera was just by tracing the lines into that vanishing point. One-point perspective is something I struggled with as a student, all perspective really, but once you get it, you'll get it. So go slowly. It's actually quite simple, and I'll try to really simplify it for you. Really, it's a system that produces the illusion of dimensional depth, as we've discussed. So we're going to start with the picture plane, because everything happens in relation to that. Now forgive me outside here if some of these lines don't look straight. There is a little bit of lens distortion towards the outer sides of this, so I'll do the best I can. So the picture plane doesn't have to be a rectangle, but in our culture it most often is. We have talked about how we tend to put our media in rectangles and so forth. So we'll start with that. We'll use that as a frame, or a way of encapsulating, or a window into this world we're creating. Once we have a picture plane, the next thing is to determine where the eye line of the viewer is going to be. It can be anywhere in the picture plane, In a photograph we can determine it very easily, as we'll see. But in drawing, we're the creators of this world, so we'll put in the eye line of the viewer where we see fit. This is an eye, and the horizon line, as it's often called, really should be called the eye line, because it isn't the horizon. It just determines where the eye level of the viewer is. So once we determine that, we'll just pop that in. It can be anywhere in the picture plane. It can be even slanted, it can be up here. That just indicates where the eye level of our viewer is going to be. After we put in the eye level, or the eye line, or the horizon line, we're going to put in a vanishing point. And this is why it's called one-point perspective, because we're just going to have one vanishing point. There are some tricks to where to put that. We can determine that again in a photograph, but for now, let's just arbitrarily put it in. It's important that it's on the horizon line. Sometimes students will put it off the horizon line, but the whole point is to put that point right on the horizon line. There, in one-point perspective, this is a system that assumes that we're looking straight on at an object, not from a corner. So we'll start with boxes. And there are three kinds of lines in one-point perspective. There are lines that are perpendicular to the horizon line, parallel to the horizon line, and then a system of lines called orthogonals that vanish into that point. They all converge into that point. And forgive me, I'm drawing around a camera, so I'm not really getting it straight. But we could probably be better off to use a ruler, which I kind of never do. But for learning, you might want to just do that, right? You'll get more accurate type lines. Okay, and then I'll determine how deep I want this box. I'll make another perpendicular line. I'll make a parallel line. I'm going to shade the bottom of it because, again, it's above the eye line, so I'll see underneath it. And there you have it. I'll erase out some of these construction lines so you can get a better view of the illusion of a floating brick or box or whatever. And there it is. Nice thing about this system is that it works anywhere on the picture plane. So again, parallel, perpendicular lines, and the orthogonals that vanish into our vanishing point. And here, because it's below the eye line, I'm going to see the top of the box. And I'll just erase those out again so we get a better illusion. And if it's on the horizon line, same rules apply. And I'll just erase that out. Now I'm being very sloppy. I think, when you're first starting out, it is wise to use a ruler just so you can be a little more accurate than I am. But it is important to note that perspective drawings can look a little stiff and mathematical. So I tend to be, I guess I understand the rules enough so that I can just sort of loosely put them in. And you'll get there too with just a little bit of practice. And it creates this sense of dimensional depth. Of course, lots of mistakes that I can correct at some point. It gives us this illusion that there's a distance and a foreground. And from here, once we master the basic shape of a box in one-point perspective, we can build upon that and do a lot of really complicated, complex things. So that's what we'll do now. Just practice drawing boxes in one-point perspective until we get that down. Remember, we have a picture plane, we have the eye line or the horizon line, we drop in a vanishing point, and then we have parallel, perpendicular, and orthogonal lines to create the illusion of dimensional depth. Alright, so that's it. Hopefully it was fairly clear, but really the practice is essential here. So what I want you to do is create 4 picture planes, 4 rectangular picture planes. I'd like you to place the horizon line at different places in each. Towards the top, towards the middle, towards the bottom, and on the 4th one, do a diagonal horizon line. And then place vanishing points on each. Remember that there are only 3 kinds of lines in one-point perspective. Lines that are parallel to the horizon line, so even if it's diagonal, it needs to be parallel. Perpendicular to the horizon line, and with the orthogonals that vanish into the vanishing point. On each of those 4 picture planes with various positioned horizon lines or camera lines or eye lines, I want you to put at least 5 different boxes on each one in various places, just to practice. You can use a ruler. The last thing I want you to do then is to use a 1-point perspective picture plane. Place the object, the horizon line or the camera line, sort of towards the bottom third of the page, and I'll write these directions down, and then try to create a house in 1-point perspective. There are plenty of tutorials online, so if mine isn't working for you, or if I've not explained things clearly enough, or you need more reinforcement of these concepts, definitely Google 1-point perspective tutorial and you'll find more tutorials than you could shake a stick at. Alright, good luck, have fun with it. Be patient with yourselves, because sometimes it takes a little bit to get this concept, and that's okay. Alright, we'll see you next time.